Welcome to episode 4 of Foundational Foundry, the second part in our look at the Foundry map editor. With me are various peoples of much Foundry knowledge: Durgan1701, Duncan Idaho,
Ahoy hoy.
and Mark Hockman.
Hey.
Alright, in the last episode we started diving into the various parts of the map editor, but up until now we've only been looking at space maps. Today we're going to take and turn our attention to the other two kinds of maps, ground and interior. Let's start off with ground maps. This would be analogous to Captain Kirk beaming down to the surface of a planet. It's an outdoor setting, usually with a ground, a sky, and probably lots of vegetation. These, you have to use default or stock ones. We can't customize the ground at all. So choose your. We have a good selection of different. So we have different locations, biomes, and as well as a selection of maps pulled from existing missions. Like there's the Coliseum. Icy Hills. I mean, so it's worth pulling through to kind of just find the right environment for your map. Lots of different options there. In ground maps, we have the extra tab buildings, which are exactly what they sound like. These are larger structures that you can place on the map. So if I wanted a Cardassian colony there, I could place a bunch of Cardassian assets.
There are a few things that are in both the Buildings tab and the Detail Objects tab, but it's not a whole lot of objects.
Yeah,
Mostly it's the generic blocks in the building block and foundational block categories. And the one
I
thing...
think foundation walls, too.
Yeah, anything that's a foundation or block, wall, building block, platform wall, all that's pretty consistent. There's a few miscellaneous items too, but those exceptions you can discover for yourself, or we'll get into those later. The one thing that's worth keeping in mind is that because these are ground environments with lots of objects packed in, you do have to be a lot more conscious of the object limit. And if you're running into problems specifically on maps that have a lot of those foundational elements, it is worth keeping in mind that, hey, I might want to use more building assets because I need more details or vice versa. But that only applies to the generic blocks. What we've placed are buildings, which are very sensibly placed in this category.
Yeah. And object limits are a whole other subject. I will just say that planets and buildings objects tend to be about 64, or you can place 64 objects per map. Detail objects are much higher at 475. So just something to keep in mind as you're building map. I imagine that most people starting out won't have too much trouble with the object limit unless they become, or like some master builder in their first mission out. But for the most part, I think you'll.
I hit the building
like yourself.
Yeah, I hit the building limit on my first mission. I didn't hit the detail limit, but I hit the building limit.
Building limit is 60, by the way.
Yeah.
I thought it was 64.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, I will say, I think it goes without saying, you are not expected to create a master opus your first time out.
No. And it's probably advisable that you don't try that just because those are big, those are complicated, but we can get into story points at a later time.
All right, so I will quickly talk over. The third type of map is is interior maps. And again, these are pre-made only. We don't have the ability to customize interior maps. But again, we have a selection of all sorts of different interiors to work from the various themes. Okay, so in this case, you can see we've got a Cardassian interior. I think this was this is from the old mission DS9 shutdown. So it's kind of a Cardassian theme, lots of running. It's a super long mission. Or was. I think it got removed. In this case, you'll just notice that there isn't an extra tab like there is on the ground and space. It's just all detail. And obviously the space you work in is already kind of defined for you. Some of us like to build in the black space, but that's a whole other concept that I'm sure we'll get to later. For the most part, I think for your first mission, I think we'll just be sticking to stock maps and working with them for our purposes. One last thing I'm going to show is, let's say you've got all your assets placed and you want to see how does it look. Well, you can preview the map right here with the play map, which actually reminds me, I should point out these guys up here are very important. This one right here is the view mission waypoints. So let's say, for instance, I had my station as an objective. Not showing there. Let me try it with the ground map.
Well, certain kinds of objectives just don't show up on the mini map at all.
That could be.
Well, one interesting thing with the
it's just space maps.
reach marker. The interesting thing with the reach marker tasks is that the size of the green circle on the mini map is actually the radius that you put in for the reach marker itself.
Okay, so it looks like it's just just isn't showing up for space maps. So yeah, you can see here with the ground map, I've made this interacting with this building an objective, and you can see it shows the ring around it to indicate that it's a objective, and this is what will be highlighted on the mini map when that objective is active. You can turn that on and off. This one right here is enable translation snap to grid. Translation is movement or moving objects. This is important because snap to grid is kind of nice for broad strokes of getting things lined up. But for instance, if you're let's see, let's find a tree.
Well, here I'll give an example of something I did in one of my missions. I placed a table on the map, and then I placed several objects on top of the table to make it look like there was someone eating food at the table recently. If you have snap to grid on, there is absolutely no way you can place a cup and bowl on top of the table unless it just happens to come out the right spot. It probably won't.
So yeah, you can't make those fine adjustments with snap to grid on. It's more for trying to line up walls.
It's useful if you need to create a large, the wall structure is a great one. Also floors if you get into creating a custom floor, but you generally don't need to do that for most of the missions. You'll be modifying straight up from a new perspective. But it's sort of just, if you need to create a regular pattern of something, snap to grid is generally pretty good for that. You can then modify it later, but it is definitely the broad strokes tool.
Yeah. I should also point out that it defaults back to on whenever you start up or load into the mission. And much to the chagrin of many authors who forgot to turn it around, if I'm like fine tuning this tree and I forget that it's or been switched back on, it'll snap to the grid as soon as I try to adjust it. So
Yeah, just highlighting the object causes it to snap to grid.
Yeah. It may be worth mentioning at this point that the Foundry does have an undo button.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's Control Z, or you can just go up into
Edit,
undo.
Well, one interesting thing that probably good to point out is that Snap to Grid puts some very strange numbers for the XYZ coordinates. This is apparently because the Foundry actually stores all of the coordinate information in feet, and Snap to Grid causes it to snap to a location that is an even number of feet. Then it displays the coordinates in meters.
Yeah, so back when the Foundry originally started, everything was in feet. And the grid for Snap to Grid is still in feet. These numbers are meters, because meters are what Star Trek used. And somebody decided that they were going to switch it over to meters. But either way. So you've got your map all set up, and you want to see how it looks. You hit the play button here, and we get to sit and watch the loading map box for a bit. This takes a while. I'll just say that right now. And the bigger your mission gets, the longer it'll take to preview a map. So, I mean, I have maps that are missions that have like 10 or 11 maps, and all of them are these elaborate builds with many, many, many objects, and it can take a little while to preview a map. Sometimes I will actually load up a...
By a little while, you really only mean a couple of minutes. But
Yeah.
That's still longer than your average stow load time.
But I mean, if you're jumping back in and out of the preview, you do notice it. And like sometimes if I'm trying to work out or test something, I'll actually load up an empty mission I keep, just so I can preview it more quickly.
And if you feel like you're jumping in and out of preview a lot, don't worry, that is normal.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
All right, so we have our map here, and it turned out pretty nice for just throwing some things down. Obviously, the ground isn't very even in this area, so buildings are a little fun, but I mean, they didn't turn out too bad. I think this is actually a really good time to talk about the relative to or y relative to field. In this particular case, the y relative to is set to terrain, and as you can see, it's kind of trying to keep the buildings flush with the ground, or based on where its origin point is. And in some cases, I mean, it's doing a pretty decent job. I mean, and in other cases, it's just a bit bizarre because the ground is really uneven here. And that's a good thing to note, is that there is a lot of trial and error in the Foundry.
Also, relative to terrain does not necessarily put things relative to what you see as being the contour of the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a perfect system. Sometimes you get weird outliers. Maybe a map just isn't set up quite properly, or the building's origin point is actually really far off from its geometry.
Another is how many maps will have baked-in assets that are on top of the ground. If you use relative to terrain, sometimes it will use the actual ground and not the baked-in assets.
Yeah,
and on some maps, those are actually extremely large assets because they're these giant rocks.
Yeah, for instance, if I put my building right there, I could very well end up spiking up to the top of that spike or not. Kind of depends on how the map is built. All right, so here's the field I'm talking to right here, right? Y relative to, and you can see it's set to terrain. And And we can also set to geometry, in which case it'll most likely, it really will appear at the top of that little spike there. And the Foundry's been around long enough that it's gone through a few iterations, so there's also legacy train and legacy geometry.
I'm actually not sure what the difference on that is. I've tinkered with it, and
yeah,
I don't see a difference.
In most cases, it exists because they adjusted how the train calculations worked at some point, and this was there for legacy missions that may have been using the old system. They didn't want to mess it up. The key one that I want to point out here is zero altitude. This option is what you use if you're trying to place an asset very specifically, and like relative to terrain is just not working for you. It's throwing out something weird, and it's not doing what you want. You can basically say, enough with that. I just want to do relative to zero. This is going to require more trial and error because you don't know initially exactly where zero is in the map. But the important thing is that zero will be consistent.
Well, there's one specific situation where relative to zero is almost mandatory, and that is when you are building a complex out of multiple buildings, because you cannot get the foundations to line up right on most maps if you build it relative to terrain, simply because the terrain varies in height, and thus you end up with all sorts of different heights of objects.
Yeah, and that also applies to placing any kind of object in series that you want to line up. Shelving, chairs, benches, floor units, ceiling items. If you need something to be consistently at the same height, zero altitude is definitely your friend.
Yeah, so for instance, I've put all these buildings together, and hopefully they will appear to be connected. Sometimes, like I said, you get outliers, or you've got some building that has a weird origin point. But yeah, I mean, it basically ensures that all the objects that you're working with have the same, or working off of the same numbers. Because obviously, in the case of this map, we're like, our terrain isn't even. Okay, so obviously it's below the ground, but Cardassians might not have been the greatest examples, but you can kind of see here where the roofs are lining up. And as with everything, I mean, a lot of cases you'll just end up having to tweak it until it looks right.
Yeah, well, one thing for tweaking incessantly that's very useful is placing the spawn point next to the object you're tweaking, so that as soon as you load into the map, you'll load in so that you're looking at the object, and then you don't have to go the time of running over to where the object is.
All right, so I think that is most everything we can cover about the map editor. I realize that was a really long description, but I mean, like I said, the map editor is where you're going to be spending the majority of your time. That about covers it for the map editor. It took us 2 episodes, but as I said, it's where you'll spend the majority of your time. So to recap, in this episode, we looked at ground and interior maps. We also talked about snap to grid and explained the why relative to, as well as previewing maps. We're almost through our overview of the Foundry editor. In our next episode, we'll be looking at the final 2 tabs, dialogue and costumes. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next time. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Night good.